everyone. My name is Natalie Starks. Welcome, everyone. I'm the General Manager of Partnerships and Marketing for the Resilience Canopy, and I'm facilitating the session today. I'm really pleased to be facilitating the session as well. Our session today is with Michelle Tjondro from SGS Economics and Planning, and we're going to have a really rich data-rich but accessible session ahead of us today. Before we kick off, I would like to acknowledge country, the traditional custodians of our land, elders past and present, and the inherent resilience and wisdom continuously passed down through them. Acknowledging also that we're coming from many different areas today. A reminder that the session is recorded and will be shared later for those who are unable to make it today. We do love to see your faces if you're happy to show them as well. If you're new to these sessions, thank you for coming along. The Resilience Canopy is a not-for-profit movement helping communities across Australia become stronger and more challenge-ready, adaptable to climate disruptions and social stresses. The Canopy Collective, it's a network that connects Canopy trained practitioners and communities with others working in resilience around topics of interest. Through the collective, we hold a series of check-ins for those involved in the Canopy program, as well as masterclasses and keynotes that are open to a broader audience. I'll take just a moment to give you a bit of an insight into what we have coming up. We have a masterclass with placemaking pioneer Jabeur Rochecoste, speaking about a regenerative approach to designing and activating places with a focus on healing ecosystems. That's on October 25 at 10 a.m. And we've got a keynote on October 8. Sorry, that's on September 25. I'm already heading to October with apologies. A keynote on October 8 with the Insurance Council of Australia's Duncan Shepherd and climate change adaptation specialist Melinda Morris from UTS for a practical conversation about managing climate risk. The year is going quickly, but apologies for that. So look out for those. On to today's session. So Michelle is a senior associate with SGS Economics and Planning and a lead author of the SGS Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index. She works with governments and the for-purpose sector to improve social and spatial justice outcomes in Australian communities. Now, the SGS Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index is described as the only objective community scale wellbeing framework in Australia and is designed for policy action and measuring outcomes at a local scale. So today's session has attracted good interest from a varied audience, given the climate we find ourselves in currently. We know that our own individual and collective wellbeing is influenced by factors such as safety, health, happiness, job satisfaction, social connections, and access to nature. Combined with the rising cost of living, housing issues, and increasing homelessness, impacts of drought and other pressures in regional and rural areas, and the dire warnings through the National Climate Risk Assessment released this week, things can sound pretty bleak. What SGS hopes the Wellbeing Index does is provide a data-driven platform to better inform conversations, policies, and decision-making for a more hopeful future. Today, Michelle will take us through a data-rich but accessible session, as I said, for anyone working to improve place-based outcomes. So a little bit about the format. We'll have the opportunity for questions after a short presentation from Michelle. So make sure you pop the questions into the chat. And at the end, Michelle is also going to provide a little bit of a sneak peek into the next version of the online index that's still under development. And with thanks to Michelle. Over to you.
Thanks, Natalie, for the warm welcome. And it's really good to be here this morning and share this hour with you all. Thank you also for the acknowledgement of country. Myself, I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. And I think as we are gathered here to share ideas and experiences about what it will take to improve wellbeing outcomes across Australia, there's a lot in the practices and knowledge of Australia's First Peoples that we can be guided by. So hopefully you can all see my slides. And Natalie has provided a bit of an introduction. So at SGS, we are a national team of public policy professionals. We work across a range of policy areas from housing to strategic land use planning to population forecasting and everything in between. But why I'm here today, so my particular interest is in the wellbeing economy. So in other words, an economy that serves people and planet and how we can really safeguard and bolster community wellbeing in times of economic and social change. So that's a little bit about my research interest and what we do at SGS. So, what I wanted to start with is really by highlighting the power of place and why it is that so much of our work at SGS is informed by spatial thinking and an appreciation of the diversity of Australian cities and regions. And at its heart, it's really because place shapes so many parts of our everyday life in ways that we may not necessarily be conscious of based on our life stage and the intersections and interface that we have with the health system, education, and so on and so forth. So, as I mentioned, where we live directly influences our access to healthcare, other services, quality of schools, whether we have options around us for affordable rentals, and the list goes on. So, what's also really important when we're talking about the power of place and how we understand that to support better public policy and improved community outcomes is being able to tap into evidence about place at the right spatial scale. So, what do I mean by that? Well, if we've got national and state level data, of course, that is really handy for a headline. Maybe if we're wanting to compare national progress with our peer countries, for example. But at that scale, data and indicators can also hide really big differences between places. They can blur the reality of what's being felt at that neighbourhood scale. So, for example, we can't know from a state or a national headline exactly where we need to expand access to GPs or exactly where we need to build new homes. For tailored policy and investment, spatially detailed data really becomes quite important. So that's really the starting point for, our inspiration for developing the Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index. So on my next slide, I wanted to share a little bit more around the evolution of the CRWI, as I'll call it from now on. It's a bit of a mouthful. Its evolution over time. And it really started, hopefully you can see that, it really started more than 10 years ago when SGS self-funded research to fill a data gap at the neighbourhood scale. And originally, our focus was on developing small area estimates of gross regional product based on gross domestic product data, which is available at the national scale. So GDP being the value of all goods and services produced in the economy. So this was really useful, because it meant that we could understand the differences in economic strengths across Australia. So, for example, I've just been up to Muswellbrook, up in the New South Wales Hunter region. That is an economy with a long success and history of mining and energy generation. And where I'm based now in Sydney, we know that our city economies are largely knowledge-based. They've got clusters of business, innovation, knowledge spillovers, largely based on the knowledge economy and professional services. So, understanding those differences is important because it has implications for how we source the right workforce, how we design skills and training pathways to support that, access to skills and talent, and so on. So, that understanding of economies at the fine-grained spatial detail was really important, and that was a publication that we ran for around 8 or 9 years. That brings us to 2020. So in 2020, we expanded that publication to look at, yes, the economy, but also spatial trends in the labour force participation by gender and employment status. And from there, we can start to see patterns emerge around, female workforce participation over time. That's been growing in Australia in recent decades. We also know that there are strong gendered patterns in terms of, males and females working part-time versus full-time versus in apprenticeship, and traineeship and different employment categories. So that really shed light, looking at the economy, but also the patterns of participation across different population groups and how we can support that in terms of improving participation in, let's say, underrepresented cohorts as well. Since 2022, what we did was to significantly expand the Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index to include 6 additional wellbeing dimensions alongside economy. And I'll share more about what those dimensions are on the next slide. But really, our motivation was to explore a more holistic measure of objective wellbeing. Focusing on the things that matter. You may have heard that increasingly governments around the world and at all levels in Australia are looking beyond GDP. GDP is quite an elegant measure of economic progress, but it doesn't differentiate between, let's say, the harm that's caused by growing tobacco sales with, the benefits of other industries growing, let's say, in the emerging clean energy sector. So it doesn't make that distinction, and that's where other indicators will really prove useful in creating that more holistic understanding of what's happening on the ground across the nation. So our next release of the Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index will be at the end of this month, and I'm really pleased to be here today just to share a preview of the dashboard and some of the insights that we've been delving into. So this is the framework on a page. As you can see, there are 7 dimensions and 24 indicators. How the headline index is constructed, each of the 7 dimensions are equally weighted, and then also within each of the dimensions, the different indicators are equally weighted. So we don't make any assessment as to which one of these is more important for community wellbeing. That's really our rationale for the equal weighting across the index. And the next question that you might have is, where do we actually source this data? As you can imagine, for an index that is available at the local government area level, at the neighbourhood scale, it is quite challenging to find data that ideally is available annually so that it's, timely and frequently updated, and at that spatial scale. Many of our indicators are sourced from the Australian Bureau of Statistics Census of Population and Housing. There are also other open data sets represented across this framework. And then there are a couple of proprietary data sets that SGS develops each year. So those include the economic indicators that I mentioned on the previous slide, but also the SGS Rental Affordability Index, which sits under the housing dimension. The other thing that I want to point out is that our CRWI is in its early stages of development, so we know that the framework is not perfect in its current form. We would love to be able to include an indicator or indicators around transport accessibility, digital accessibility. Of course, there are others that you may suggest as well, and that's why we're really keen to hear from you. After this session and after the release of our next publication on how we can really enhance it in the future. So a bit about what's new and what you can expect to see in this year's publication. So firstly, a closer look at how wellbeing dimensions interact. So, what I mean by that is that, yes, we can measure outcomes in each of those indicators or dimensions in isolation, but I think where the really richer picture emerges is understanding the complexity of how those different indicators interact. So for example, air quality and a healthy environment that impacts population health over time, and that over time also impacts labour productivity. So how can we draw out those insights to provide policymakers and governments with an understanding of which levers they can pull, which they can address in order to improve outcomes over the long term. I mentioned that the framework is in its early stages, and so we're constantly refining it to meet user needs and to be really responsive to that. So this year we've got a new health and environmental indicator. and then an enhanced public dashboard. So you can hop onto our website and have a look at the dashboard from the previous 2 years. But this year, which I'll be providing a preview of the dashboard today, it'll have a different look and feel. And we've done that really in response to user feedback around the breadth of features that we show, what's most useful to them, what provides a good entry point for users who are sort of at the start of their understanding around objective wellbeing in communities. And, you know, behind all of that is really our motivation at SGS is to make those insights accessible. It's a starting point for those conversations about, you know, what's needed and really where in Australia that's needed. So on the next few slides, I'll have a couple of charts that I really hope will get us thinking about what we can learn from other places in Australia. You know, there's a tendency to look at, let's say, our LGA and surrounds and make those comparisons there. But if we've got that national view, the huge benefit of that is that we might be able to compare what wellbeing looks like in our neighbourhood with an LGA that's on the other side of Australia, but has a similarly sized economy or similar population size. And what can we learn from those LGAs and what they've done, you know, to support wellbeing outcomes in our local context. So that's really why I've chosen to show the data in this way to provide a national view. So to explain a little bit the chart on the right, what it shows is that there is what you might call a proximity advantage in terms of, you know, the wellbeing outcomes of cities and regions that are located closer to capital cities. They tend to perform better on headline wellbeing. So remembering that headline wellbeing is a function of those 7 dimensions that I talked about. And on that headline wellbeing measure, you can see that these LGAs, where each dot represents one LGA, they're clustered towards the top left of this chart. So you can see that they're quite close to their nearest capital city. Some of them are the capital cities themselves, and they're clustered towards this top, towards the top in terms of the headline index. And as you get further away from a capital city, you can start to see more and more rural and urban regional LGAs pop up in the chart. And, you know, you can see that the gentle slope, so slightly lower headline wellbeing there. That's really what the chart is showing. But what I want to emphasize as well is that, you know, we do notice that there were quite a few outliers in regional and rural areas that still perform quite well. And the value of this is being able to understand what's happening there, what can we learn from those contexts. So I've highlighted just a couple, and I must confess I have only been to Western Australia a couple of times in my life, so there may be some in the audience who are more familiar with the context of these LGAs, but when I did take a look at some of these LGAs that are quite far from their nearest capital city, but still perform on par with some of our, you know, urban contexts, what's happening there. So Exmouth in Western Australia, for example, you know, that's the headline wellbeing index is really being driven by a higher than state average employment and participation rate. Cassowary Coast in Queensland, it performs quite well on the entropy index, which is a measure of industry diversity. So, you know, that is really just to show the importance of looking at it, this through an opportunity lens. So yes, it's helpful to compare different contexts, but again, what can we learn from neighbouring LGAs or even LGAs on the other side of the nation? On what is shaping up their headline wellbeing and what's working and what's working less well. So my next chart here is around the economy dimension. So here we've looked at proportionate growth in the LGA's economy between similarly sized LGAs in terms of population. So each of these rows contains the LGAs in each of these population bands. So smaller LGAs on the bottom row, so between 2 and 5,000 in terms of population size, all the way up to LGAs with over 500,000 people. So that's what that's what the y-axis is looking at, and population as at the 2021 ABS census, I should specify. On the x-axis here is the year-on-year growth in gross regional product. So you can see that a lot of the larger LGAs, so Brisbane, Sydney, that I've highlighted here, they're starting economies. It's already a large size, and they've grown. Their growth in the year to 2024 is clustered around the 5 to 10% growth mark. Once you get down to the smaller LGAs by population size, you can see there's quite a bit more variability in their growth in the year to 2024 and in the growth potential. And I've just highlighted a couple here as well. So Isaac in Queensland. Muswellbrook that I mentioned in New South Wales. These are economies where mining is the largest output generating sector. But at the same time, as I know from my work with Muswellbrook, many of these towns are looking to the opportunity of renewable energy, what that means for industry diversity in the future, and being able to build economic resilience. So I think this is really useful to see in terms of the variability, but also some of the similarities between economies, and that they're more similar than you might expect. As I mentioned before as well, why did we choose to expand the Cities and Regions Wellbeing Index to the additional 6 dimensions? Yes, I'm looking at GRP growth on this chart here, but GDP is not, the end goal. When we look at this chart, we should also be thinking about what the proper management of economic growth looks like, so that the impacts on housing affordability, housing availability, access to services, population growth can be managed to sustain a good quality of life for existing residents and new residents in the local area. I mentioned before that one of the indicators in our index is the SGS Rental Affordability Index, or RAI. And here we've got a series of charts that look at rental affordability by remoteness. So I just want to first explain what the Rental Affordability Index is. That's also another annual publication of SGS's that you can head to our website to have a look at the report there. But in a nutshell, the SGS RAI tracks rental affordability at a postcode level relative to the average income for different household profile types. So if affordable rental is spending less than 30% of your income on rent, we've compared what rental is in that local area with the average income of those household types. So whether you're a pensioner household, dual income household across 10 different types, to develop a price index around affordability. And what these charts show, so there's one chart for each of the states. Northern Territory, we don't have for the RAI because there's no rental data input that we're able to rely on. But what these charts show, the left column is 2023, the right column is 2024, where the line is sloping upwards, that's an improvement in rental affordability. Where it's sloping downwards, that's a decrease in rental affordability. And the colours just denote whether it's a rural, urban, or an urban fringe LGA. So to talk a little bit about the insights here, so the high level insights here, there are some really clear patterns that emerge. So if you look at the green teal lines here, which represent rural areas, you can see that particularly in Western Australia and in New South Wales, these rural areas are some of the hotspots of rapidly decreasing rental affordability. I do want to note, though, that rental affordability can be quite volatile in rural areas. So that's just something to note when we're interpreting the data. Rental affordability is already quite poor and has been for some time, as we know, in urban areas. But what we saw in some states, again in Western Australia and New South Wales, is that it is experiencing further declines. And then when we look at regional city, so these are the lines in red, rental affordability is broadly stable in some states, namely Victoria, Queensland, and South Australia, but that it fell in New South Wales. And I thought that was quite interesting. You know, why might that be happening in some states and not others in the regional cities context? And we know from research by the Regional Australia Institute that regional New South Wales and regional Victoria do attract the lion's share of city movers. So it could be that those internal migration patterns are placing additional strain on the housing markets of those regional cities. So this is my last chart for today, and this shows the geography of Australia's gender pay gap. So what we find here is that a gender pay gap exists everywhere. How we've calculated that is to look at the difference between the average male weekly income by LGA and the average female weekly income by LGA. And how we can interpret this chart is that each pair of purple and green dots, so let's take this one as an example, each pair of purple and green dots represents the average male in purple and the female in green weekly income by LGA. And where you've got a bigger gap, that means that there's a bigger gender pay gap in that LGA. And I've highlighted some here on the right. So these are organized in order of ascending pay gap. And so you can see I've highlighted some LGAs. Ashburton, where on average the weekly male income is, $1,300 compared to female, so it's almost double that of the female weekly income. Roxby Downs as well, a $500 weekly gap, and in Waypar as well. What's happening in these communities that's really driving such a big gap? Some of the largest gaps across Australia. Well, when I delved into the context there, these towns are mining communities, and it's where the combination of a really high-paying mining industry and traditionally lower female participation in that industry is really exacerbating that gender pay gap there. But, what we see as well, as I mentioned at the start, is that gender pay gap really exists nationally. So if we look to some of the urban and urban fringe LGAs, if we look at some of the urban regional ones, what we can see is, yes, the kind of the two lines, the line of purple and green is less pronounced in terms of the difference. But, areas like in Queanbeyan and Palerang, it's got a high proportion of public administration as the main industry of employment there. There's still a gender imbalance and a gender pay gap still exists, but it's smaller. So what is the implication there? It's really that systemic change is needed to promote transparency in pay, to remove some of the structural biases in employment patterns across the nation. So three takeaways from my presentation today. Beyond the data itself, what I want to really emphasize is that for a long time now, society, and not just in Australia, but overseas as well, has been focusing on measures like GDP for too long. And what that's done is, it's really had an enduring impact on broader wellbeing outcomes because it's stalled progress on some of the other measures around social, human, environmental development, and the things that also matter to our quality of life. And what I think as well is that, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, but what I think as well is that, this steadfast focus on economic growth has almost encouraged a tendency to think that it is around economic growth at all costs, that it necessarily competes with social and environmental priorities, when we should actually be looking at the system as a whole, how improvements in one area, one of those dimensions, can benefit, outcomes in other dimensions. And that's why we're really keen on looking at the interactions between those dimensions, as I talked about before. The diagram at the right really highlights, where we see the SGS cities and regions Wellbeing Index sitting in the context of other initiatives, other scholarship that's out there. So you can see that, there are national frameworks such as the Australian government's Measuring What Matters framework, which they released in 2023. There are some distinctions between the framework, but the idea is that, all of these initiatives should complement one another. And then we've also got international frameworks, such as the OECD's How's Life framework, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of course, which track a whole range of indicators, and the 17 goals. And then, of course, looking at regional and local wellbeing measures. So local governments and many others in community are taking inspiration from some of these frameworks and seeing, what indicators best meet the measurement and monitoring needs of their local communities. So being able to localize those insights to the context. And then on these to the left and the right, we can see that, what could be really useful as well is looking at some of these measurement frameworks through a population cohort lens. So a framework that is specific to the experience of Australian First Peoples or specific to the experience of migrants or culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Whereas the data that we look at in our index is at the population and community scale. And of course, as I mentioned, always having an eye towards continual improvement. What indicators and other data sets can we tap into to really enhance and enrich the insights of our index? And then the last thing here is around subjective well-being. So, our index looks at objective well-being, but it's also important, to consider the experience of individuals, their perspectives, their outlooks. That is not captured in our index, but is an important part of the story about how people feel about their lives and how they experience services and the other things that improve their quality of life. So there are, surveys from the University of Canberra run their regional wellbeing survey that looks at wellbeing and quality of life in rural and regional areas. It provides a better gauge of individual wellbeing. So this is my last slide. And what's next for us? Well, firstly, as I mentioned, we're looking forward to launching the publication towards the end of the month. So there you'll be able to access the dashboard and a report. We are always keen to hear from you around how users of the index can bring the data to life. So please get in touch about how you're using these insights in your work and in community. Help us enhance the index for next year and future publications. If you know of a suitable data set, have a suggestion for the dashboard and its features, please get in touch with us. And of course, collaboration. So we know that, at SGS, we do work in collaboration with many community experts. And so there are opportunities there to work on future research together. So we'd be keen to hear from you. Please get in touch, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share just a sneak peek of what we've been working on over the last couple of months. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michelle. I think it'd be great if we could touch on in a minute some of the maybe public policy work or examples of how you've seen the data being used, because data tells a story and not the whole story, of course. So we might do that in a moment. But I am just wondering, if we talk about headline generalizations, like what story does the index tell us about the well-being of the nation and our neighborhoods? Is there a headline generalization that can be drawn, or can it not be?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, one that we do get asked quite often, because the data is available at different spatial scales, so that can lead to different conclusions about what's happening at the national, at the regional, and at the local level. But in my view, what the index really does, its key utility is that it shines a light on the unique strengths of Australian communities and economies, and that, of course, to return to your earlier point around the uncertainty that we face in our communities day to day, that has to give us hope when navigating uncertain times. The fact that other communities, other economies may have tread the path that your local context is facing right now. And so we can really learn from that. Those are the foundations that I think we can build on and learn from.
So the index, the work that you've been doing is, been over the last couple of years and continuing to grow. Are there any trends that you've seen in that time, positive or negative?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the one around rental affordability. So we do continue to see decreasing rental affordability. It's no longer contained just in urban areas now. And I think that's really front of mind for many communities and local governments because they're having to manage the frontline impacts of that. In New South Wales, where I'm based, there's the impacts of major infrastructure development with the special activation precincts, with the renewable energy zones. In Queensland, we've got the Olympics coming up. All of this is creating a crunch for access to workers. If you've got an influx of workers, that of course raises demand for temporary accommodation. And so, the policy implication there around, the importance of coordinating across different project timelines, access to workforce and the right skills. So, that trend in rental affordability, is playing out in, I think, really real ways for both incoming residents, but also residents, existing residents, in community.
Your presentation indicated that, let's call it a generalization again, but regional economies are on the rise. But then there's it's kind of bringing with it, or is it a connection that there's additional housing strain, of course, in some of those areas as well. Is that an example of the strength that the data can actually bring? To say here are, because you're talking about an opportunity lens as well, to look at the data through an opportunity lens. So,
Mm.
there's clearly a focus on economics and the strength of that, but at what cost?
Mhm.
Is that what the data, or bringing that data together can actually start to show some of the impacts or the consequences potentially?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, our cities and regions are really diverse. So, when you talk about the opportunity lens, that's exactly where we want people to focus on. It is quite counterproductive to assume that deficit lens in how we characterize well-being outcomes. So, to expand on that a little bit, even when we look at LGAs that don't perform well on the headline index, there may be still strengths in their performance on some of the dimensions. And our ambition is really to highlight that, to get people thinking about that as a starting point for what happens next, whether it's to do with policy or investment decisions. So I think there's many ways that we can use this data as a resource and a starting point. Mm.
When we spoke the other day, you indicated that the media and potentially others often focus on the worst performing LGA, and uh, and how, and is that really what the data will show? I mean, can we expand a little bit more on that in terms of through an opportunity? Like, how can that then be used for advocacy or improvement or decision making?
Yeah. Well, what we don't want, how we don't want the index to be used is as a scorecard and as something that's kind of the end point, in how people are thinking about this. Um, Sorry, I've just lost my screen, and how people are thinking about this. But how it can be used for advocacy. Really what we aim to do over time is to build up a time series of this data. So we've got this data for 2 or 3 years now. I've talked about some of the trends that we've been noticing, but imagine what we could do with a long time series of the data. What you could do then is to really track the potential impacts of policy and interventions in a particular community and to see whether or not the wellbeing performance has improved before and after. So that's one of the ways that I think using this is going to be able to support a stronger advocacy.
Mm-mm. Could you take us through a couple of examples, I suppose, on or case studies about some of the work that this has been used for?
Mm. One of the examples that comes to mind is councils who are maybe, looking at their next economic development strategy and looking at how they can embed a wellbeing economy focus in that. So how can we balance, yes, this is around economic development and, the traditional focus on attracting industry, on making the local community a good place, an easy place for small to do business, but also looking at the other dimensions of well-being that I've talked about as part of that, because we know it's all interlinked. If you've got a healthy workforce, you've got a more productive economy, you've got people who are engaged, and have access to jobs and study and all of those opportunities. So I think that's some of the ways that we're seeing this being used and embedded. People are taking inspiration from it, not necessarily adopting all 24 of the indicators. They might be blending that with other things that are really unique to their local context as well. Also taking inspiration from some of those national and international frameworks that I mentioned.
Mm. Thank you. And we've got a couple of questions coming through the chat, and if I would encourage people to pop others in there as well. So Narelle has asked, like, how does the index relate to outcomes for industry clusters or communities of practice? And Narelle, could I get you just to expand on it? Do you mean like how can the data be used in that way?
Yeah, I think that there are other agglomerations rather than that are spatial, but they also might be virtual. The idea that proximity has changed, and there are a number of dimensions. There are a number of mechanisms whereby people get together and have the benefit of being able to lead change-making activities. And industry clusters is maybe just take that one, make it simple. How could an industry cluster make use of the index as intelligence to chart a course to improve their lot?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I can't say I've had that one before. Yeah, but it's really interesting. I did mention that, we're really keen on looking at connectivity in the index. It's a gap that we're really keen to fill. As you mentioned, when there is good transport connectivity, it makes it easier for industries to expand their, expand who along the supply chain they can work with, and that has effects on knowledge spillovers and innovation and things like that. When we talk about digital connectivity as well, which is in the index at the moment, we know that in this era of remote working that we all find ourselves in post COVID-19 pandemic, what it has enabled some businesses to tap into is a remote workforce. So skills and talent that maybe pre-COVID they wouldn't have been able to access, and that can only have benefits for those, clustering and innovation that you talk about. So I think, the answer to your question is that at the moment, some of the indicators that might be of most use to the audiences that you're talking about aren't currently in our index. But, as we seek to enhance and refine it, that's one way that we really think it will help shine a light on those access, the potential from greater access.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous, thank you. And I think so that's that lines up pretty neatly with what else would you like to see in the index, and what other data points would be or data available out there to provide a more holistic picture. So amazing, thank you, thanks, Narelle. Lisa's asking, how can we use this data to understand community resilience in the face of climate change?
Yeah. Well, the relationship between well-being and resilience, I see as a mutually reinforcing one. Resilience. You need community well-being over time, sustained well-being outcomes over time, so that communities can better adapt and respond and recover from shocks. So being able to build those reserves of resilience through the well-being lens is really important. I think being able to understand as well how a community is performing across each of these dimensions kind of signals to us where or what a future policy focus might be, whether it's on education or health or housing. So I think that's one of the use cases around building community resilience, really understanding that interaction between wellbeing and resilience as well. Mm.
Staying slightly in the disaster space, just with Loriana has a question that'll be an interesting one. I don't know if this is going to come into your bailiwick or not, but are there existing data points or indicators that measure the speed and effectiveness of government responses to crisis, such as natural disasters or emerging social issues, and how these responses influence community wellbeing?
Yeah. So there is one indicator, which is a new one that we've introduced this year, and that is the DRFA activations, which I believe some in this audience may be familiar with. So that's the disaster recovery funding arrangements, and that's a process by which state and territory governments request financial assistance to support disaster recovery efforts. And the data that we have used in the index introduced this year is the number of DRFA activations by LGA. So we're very grateful that that data is available at the local scale and on an annual basis. And while it's not a perfect sort of proxy for responsiveness to crises, it does tell us how many times a local LGA might have had to rely on financial assistance. So that's what we're using and will continue to use. But we are always wanting to hear about better measures. The challenge, of course, as you know, is just the spatial detail and the timeliness of updates.
I think that one would be of interest to a number of people on the session today. So thank you. That might be something that's worth exploring a little bit further. With an eye on time, I'm wondering if we might ask you to give us a bit of a sneak peek into the index online, and then we can see if there's any further questions after that before we start things up.
No worries. Let me just get myself organized.
And while Michelle's doing that, just a reminder, if there are other questions popping in, thanks everyone for your contribution. Pop them in the chat.
So hopefully you can all see my screen. So this is the landing page. It's not live yet. As I mentioned, it's still in development, but really excited to show a sneak preview today. And the dashboard has two main views. The first is what we call the map view. So this is where on the left panel, you will be able to select either an LGA, so an LGA, a state or territory. So that's through the drop-down menu here, as well as the particular dimension. So this is the headline dimension selected. You can see how that varies across Australia. Where there are gaps, what we have done as well is to exclude LGAs with a population under 2,000. And the reason why we've done that is because of the reliability of data that feeds into it, not because we don't think that measuring and understanding community wellbeing in those areas is not important, but there are sometimes data quality issues that we run into. So what I'll do is go ahead and make a couple of selections so you can see how it all works. So if you're interested in a state, let's select New South Wales. What that will do is to zoom in to New South Wales. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time. And you can see how headline wellbeing differs across the state. Now, if I select different dimensions, so let's go ahead and do economy, you can see that it changes. And if we zoom in to Greater Sydney, for example, we can see that there are Bayside, it's where I am at the moment. We can see that the economy dimension is sitting at 3. And Inner West, and so on and so forth. I was trying to get to City of Sydney. But let's zoom out to the headline again and go to a particular LGA. So if we go to, let's say, Bayside, what that will do is to zoom in. to the headline index. And you can see something's happened on the right of the dashboard here. And that is a radar chart, which compares your LGA selection, in this case, Bayside in New South Wales, with a comparison region. And we have pre-specified the comparison region to be the Greater Capital City Statistical Area. So that's your Greater Sydney, Greater Darwin, or rest of New South Wales, rest of Western Australia. And what this shows is the performance of that LGA across the 7 dimensions compared to the comparison region. So what this is telling us is that in Bayside, it performs reasonably similarly to the average performance across the Greater Sydney LGAs. But if I select a different, let's do a regional one. If I select a regional LGA, let's look at Bega Valley. Again, reasonably similar, but you can see that some of these have shifted. So the comparison region performance as well has shifted. It's rest of New South Wales, but you can see that in Bega Valley, it actually performs better than the regional average when it comes to the environmental dimension and income and wealth. And so, you can go through these different selections to understand how that performs. And it goes to what I was saying before around the headline tells us one thing, but when you dig into the detail of the different dimensions, you can see that these shapes, on this chart shift. And what that is telling us is that, there are unique strengths and improvement areas for every LGA to be looking at when they're undertaking policy and planning. What I'll do next is to go to the other view, which is the indicator view. And because our dashboard is still in development, this portion of my presentation will not be interactive, but this is an example of what will be in the final dashboard. So again, you will have the option to select from this filter up the top an LGA of interest. And then what that will do is to update all of these 24 indicators, which are the indicators sitting across our framework. The 2 time series that we have will be the economic dimension, which you can see here, and also the rental affordability index, which is the publication we prepare every year. The other indicators will just be the latest year of data. So for some of them, it'll be 2024. For some of them, the latest year of data is 2022 or 2021. So that will all be clearly annotated, and there'll be a glossary that accompanies this as well. And over time, our hope is that some of these other indicators that we only introduced in recent years will start to have this time series that we've got for the other GVA and the RIE data. So that's really our the flag on the hill, if you will, for developing this over the long term. So I'll leave it at that in terms of the dashboard.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thanks very much for sharing that with us. I think we're a little bit lucky to have a bit of an insight into that for the first time today. I'm just wondering, for those on the session, is this something that you also would find useful, and how you think you would work with that? And I'm wondering, Maddie, just not to call you out, Maddie Hines, but in the work that you do with communities and with community leaders, is this something that would be valuable in, sitting in behind some of the work that you do, or the understanding of your communities?
Yeah, thanks, Nat. I love the call out. Certainly, it is. There can be no singular data set to rule them all. We acknowledge that. And in looking at this information, I think to have this data available at a national level is incredible, powerful, and I think has many uses for many different business cases. From our perspective, and to give context, we work in community leadership development in Northeast Victoria and Southern New South Wales, with a network across the whole of Victoria. And data is a constant source of interest, inquiry, and looking for what will help not only underpin our efforts, but also guide the way forward, so that we have something to look back at over time to see what's shifted. And it's particularly difficult sometimes to find objective data at a local level. So I absolutely think that I am very keen. That's why I was like, where is the link? How do I find this information? To drill down and explore what's there. I would add that context is everything. So looking at the data simply without context, and I think without input from the local perspective, can be interesting, perhaps even challenging. And I think that Michelle, you did a wonderful job in terms of, pulling out a number of different communities to look at similarities. But you yourself said, what did that actually mean in practice to go down at the local level and explore how that resonated on the ground. And even in looking at some of the examples provided, I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. And thinking about farming communities where, the way that even income is reported between farming couples as a reflection of some of the data is something that can't be reflected in the sets. But I think that if communities are empowered to access this information, it can certainly help to tell a compelling story or help guide the way forward. I would, on a final note, say that we have, and this is not to detract from your work at all, but the Regional Wellbeing Survey and the information that they gather from a first-hand perspective, I think is really powerful, perhaps in working with this data set together, because that is gathering first-hand insights from people that are living in the regions, and I think gives a lot more narrative and direct input as to the experience of people and their well-being and resilience. And it does have a couple of those indicators that have been talked about in the chat around the impacts of climate and disaster, social capital and resiliency. So that's my short answer.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. And I think, as you say, context is everything, and a connection between data and an index that has the potential to help inform, policy and other purposes, but with that real indication of kind of lived and feeling, and what's that meaning at a local level is a really great observation. Thank you. Laurel, I apologize for skipping over you, but Laurel has also mentioned climate vulnerability as an overlay to the index would be powerful in that. We're going to come up against time in one moment, but I think, Nicola, you have a question in the chat as well, and I wondered if you would like to finish us off and with that question.
Trying to get myself on screen, sorry. Right, might just talk while my screen kicks in, which it's not. So we're looking, there we go. We're looking to, we're using the term of economic empowerment as an overarching avenue for our philanthropy. So what we're looking to identify is communities who could address some of the areas of disadvantage, for want of a better term, by using sort of the elements of economy to actually drive that change within their community, which can be an LGA, it can be a neighborhood, it can be an online community, it can be a community of interest. And the issue is, how do we go about identifying or helping communities self-identify to have a conversation with us? And looking at this, it seems to me that we could use it in that way, looking at these various characteristics, but wanting to make sure I'm not sort of overlaying something onto this index that it's not actually supposed to do. But that was really my sort of question. How do you think this index could help philanthropy look for communities that could benefit from philanthropic investment, but using the elements of economy, a mixed market economy, social enterprise, social entrepreneurship to drive some of that change?
Yeah. Thanks, Nicola. I think that's a really great question. And, it goes to the idea of using this evidence base as a starting point, but not the only data and evidence that goes into your decision about where to prioritize investment or to design a solution with community. So, when you talk about economic empowerment, how I interpret that is giving people the opportunities to participate in study, employment, entrepreneurship, whatever that might be, on their own terms. And then, where I go in my mind with this index index is, well, we do have some indicators around the participation rate at that LGA level. We've got an indicator around employment rate, and that's the outcome, but it's not the full human story about why that rate might be low or why it might be high in a given community. And when I think about my work in regional economic development, we know that transport access is one of the key barriers to being able to sustain employment and study commitments. You know, you might land that job, but sustaining it over the long term might be quite challenging if you don't have reliable transport to get to your place of work, or the distances might be too far. You might have family commitments that kind of pull you in some directions, and your employer might not be as receptive to that. So what I'm saying here is that there are all sorts of reasons that feed in to the outcome, which is the two indicators on employment and participation that we've got in the index. You can use those outcomes to sort of identify, as you're in the first instance, where some of those transport or other challenges might be, and then you can go from there in terms of expanding on your data and evidence that feeds into your decision. So that's how I would think that it could be used in that context.
Look, that makes sense. We funded the third edition of the Australia We Want report, and it shows that 80% of those incarcerated haven't had a secondary school education. So if you can actually increase education levels, you reduce sort of entry into prison system, which makes it easier to get a job, which makes it easier to fund your life. So that's why it's in inverted commas. It's that broad term of sort of using elements of the economy to actually, for individuals, families, and communities to be able to thrive. So thank you. That was really helpful. Great answer to my question.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nicola, for asking that. We've come to time, and I think that we could probably talk a little bit more, because there's always questions for Michelle in this space. But I would just like to say a really big thank you to Michelle for giving us a sneak peek, and also providing such a great presentation for us. Just to finish it off, in terms of let's just repeat where when the new dashboard and index will be launched, just so everyone can go and jump on and have a look when it comes out.
Yeah, so at the moment we're aiming for a date of 30th of September, and I'll be sure to keep you all updated on that. So do let me know how I can make sure that everyone sort of is alerted to the new publication.
Fabulous. We might be able to also help push that out to those who are interested.
Thank you.
Big thank you for Michelle and providing us with that great presentation. And thank you for those who are on the line and just hanging over a couple of extra minutes as well for the session. And if you've missed anything, or if anyone else would like to, you think would like to see this, we'll publish a link as well so you can share it more broadly. But a big thanks to Michelle, and a big thanks to everyone for being online today.